it's newer players or ASMR enthusiasts who want to know more about Magic and the game, and playing, and maybe more experienced players who just want to hear more about their hobby in an ASMR medium. But essentially, this is a video for newer players, to give them basic deck building instruction, rules, guidance. So not everything I say is going to be a hard rule necessarily. None of these are rule and law of Magic the Gathering, but general kind of guidelines to help you get a basic and initial understanding of how to build a deck effectively. So when you decide to start playing, or as you continue playing, you can improve upon your deck building style, and hopefully improve your overall gameplay and experience. So I am going to focus initially on 60 card constructed formats. There's Modern, Pioneer, Legacy, and Vintage. I'd say are probably the most popular 60 card formats. And then also, probably one of the most popular formats or ways to play Magic right now is 100 card EDH, which stands for Elder Dragon Highlander, I think, but most commonly referred to as Commander. I'm going to focus mostly on these 60 card formats. That is a horrible arrow. There we go, I guess that's better. But we're going to focus mostly on the 60 card formats. And then I'll do a little bit of talking about Commander, or EDH, whatever you want to call it, and give you some tips, some assistance, and some advice for building a 100 card EDH or Commander deck. So, as we mentioned, the 60 card formats, the most popular ones probably are Modern, Standard, Legacy, Vintage. I think I forgot Standard when I mentioned Pioneer, but Modern, Pioneer, Standard, Legacy, Vintage are probably, that might be all. Well, no, there's Pauper, there's definitely more, but the most popular ones are Modern, Standard, Legacy, Vintage, maybe Pioneer. And these formats require you to have a minimum deck size of 60 cards, as I mentioned before. So, if you're planning on, again, I'm not going to focus on any of the specific formats themselves or decks within them. I'm going to try to give you as much information as I can about building a deck, regardless of what format you're building for. So really, regardless of any of the formats I mentioned, I'm just going to give you kind of blanket statements that will hopefully help you build in any of those formats. But again, they have a 60 card minimum, and unless there is some other reason, it is mostly recommended that you play 60 cards, as every additional card that you add to the deck increases the chances that you draw a card that you did not need or do not want in a given situation. So the recommendation is, if whatever the minimum might be for a deck, typically it is most advantageous for you to play at that minimum. So if that means cutting your 61st card because it's your pet card, unfortunately that means you would have to do so. most helpful aspects of deck building that I learned was the mathematics behind deck building. And it's not that complicated math, it's all statistics and probability. And the specific type of math that we most commonly encounter in deck building is something called a hypergeometric distribution. And for those of you who might not know what a hypergeometric distribution is, it's actually pretty simple. In statistics, it's the probability of a certain amount of successes in a certain amount of draws within a population. So, in the context of Magic the Gathering, what we're really looking for, or what that really translates to, is what are the odds that you draw a specific card that you want to draw. So, if you're in a situation where you need to draw, and I guess I can give you a real life kind of situation. There's a famous video of a player at a pro tour playing a Boros burn deck. Boros being white and red. Burn being an aggressive deck that focuses on dealing direct damage to your opponent. And they needed to draw a card called Lightning Helix off the top of their library to win the game, and if they didn't, they were going to lose the game. So, just to give you contextually, in a hypergeometric distribution, I don't expect anybody to do that in their head. I certainly don't. But in that situation, the player could have done a calculation of what the odds were that they would have drawn Lightning Helix in that situation. It would have been very complicated at that point, obviously, because the game had already been underway, but essentially they would have, the calculation would be what the odds are that they would have drawn Lightning Helix based on the number of cards left in their library. So, and how many copies of Lightning Helix would be left. So if they had already played a couple of copies of Lightning Helix, and let's say they only had one copy left, so you just need to figure out the odds of success, or the probability of, I guess, one success in one draw from a population of the remaining cards in your deck. I think I'm gonna have to do some editing, because somebody just ran by my window yelling, but to restate that, what is the probability of drawing, of a success from one draw from within the population of remaining cards in their deck? Because they have one draw to draw Lightning Helix, being one success drawing Lightning Helix from however many cards are left in their library. So hopefully, by saying hypergeometric distribution, I haven't scared anybody off. It's not that complicated. It just sounds more complicated than it really is. So the way that typically I use hypergeometric distributions to assist me in deck building is to help me figure out how many copies of any given card I need in my deck. This is really helpful when deciding how many lands you need in your deck. It's also really helpful to decide how many copies of any given card you need in your deck. So for a 60 card format, you can have any number of basic lands, other lands, and other cards. You are limited to 4 copies. So you can have a deck of 59 basic mountains and 1 lightning bolt, if you so choose. you get my point. You can have any number of basic lands, being mountain, island, swamp, plains, what have you. Other lands that are not basic lands, they might have the mountain, island, plains type associated with them, but if they are not a basic land, you can only have 4 copies of those, and then any spell, so any artifact, enchantment, creature, any instant or sorcery, all of those cards you are limited to 4 copies of in your deck. So hypergeometric distributions can help you decide how many copies of a given card you might want in your deck. They'll also help you to figure out how many copies of lands you might want, or specifically basic lands you might want. And potentially for the other types of lands that have the 4 copy restriction. So while we're on the subject of mana and lands, I think an important thing, one of the most important aspects of deck building, is the mana base. That E came out weird. It's the mana base. So what your mana base is the selection of lands that you've included in your deck. Well, not necessarily lands. Mana producing in some senses. Mana producing resources that you have included within your deck. There is also, in some way, you can consider other non-mana producing cards within your mana base. For example, like land cyclers. So with the most recent Lord of the Rings set, well, not the most recent, but within the Lord of the Rings set, and I believe they might exist elsewhere in Magic, but maybe not. There were cards that can be, for 1 mana, can find another land for you. You also, in some situations, can evaluate certain card draw spells and cantrips as a portion of a land, depending on how many lands you include in your deck. All of these cards can be considered, but for the most part, I would say, obviously, the land cards that you include would most certainly make up your mana base. Any artifacts that can produce mana, any instant or sorceries or creatures that help you find lands and or produce mana can all be considered part of your mana base. So the biggest question is how many lands to include in your deck. It's one of the questions that you need to answer when you're building your deck. And there's a lot of variables that go into answering that question. For example, what kind of deck are you building? Are you building an aggressive deck that can function off fewer lands, or are you building a controller mid-range deck which needs significantly more lands in play in order to operate successfully? So we can probably talk about, at this point, the different archetypes. Whoops. The different archetypes within Magic the Gathering. So, there are 4 main archetypes in Magic the Gathering. And there are obviously variations of all of these. But when you look at the overall metagame, or when you look at the game from kind of a high level, typically we see 4 different kinds of major archetypes kinds of variations and matriculations and combinations of these types of decks. And some of them, obviously there can be pure aggro, pure mid-range, pure control, pure combo decks. And all of these archetypes require different kinds of mana bases. And what I'm about to say isn't necessarily true for all decks and all formats. But for a newer player, I think that just to get a general understanding of what these archetypes mean from a mana base perspective, so typically aggro decks need less lands to operate. Mid-range decks need a good amount of lands. I would say mid-range and control decks need a good amount of lands. I don't want to put a number associated with any of these because it varies drastically from format to format and deck to deck. But aggro decks need less lands to operate. In modern, I guess I can give you like contextually. In modern aggro decks, or an aggro deck, a burn deck should be able to operate on 2 to 3 lands. 2 is optimal, so like 1 to 2, really, honestly. But like 2 to 3, and once you hit 3, you really do not want to be playing or drawing any more lands. Mid-range is probably in, mid-range as a blanket statement in control. You want a good amount of lands. You want, a fair amount of lands in order to cast your big spells and do the things that you're trying to do to win the game. In the context of modern, the format I'm most familiar with, I don't play a lot of mid-range and control, but I would say 5 to 7 lands is really kind of getting to 5 lands in modern can be hard. It's a 4-turn format, but maybe like 4 to 6 lands is typically in modern where you want to be in order for your deck to operate. Control is tough in modern. That's kind of its own thing. And then combo is kind of a mystery. It all depends on what your card combo is. In modern, when Living End was more popular, although it is kind of coming back, Living End obviously needs 3 lands, or needed at its, when it was Violent Outburst and Shardless Agent, obviously you need 3 lands for those cards. So yeah, but it all depends on the deck itself. So combo is kind of in a weird place. Combo decks can be more like aggressive, like something like Living End, where it just wants to get to the amount of mana it needs to do its thing. But some combo decks might want more, so combo is kind of in a weird spot when it comes to mana bases. But when you're looking at these 3, aggro, mid-range, and control, just understanding that aggressive decks need less lands, mid-range decks and control decks need more lands in order to operate successfully. So, I guess from a deck building perspective, when you are building a deck, you need to ask yourself what kind of deck you are building. Are you building a deck that is more aggressive? Are you building a deck that is mid-range? Are you building a deck that is a control deck? Are you building a combo deck? And once you've answered that, obviously, if you're building an aggro deck, there is no hard rule or law that says if you're building an aggro deck, you need 20 lands. If you're building mid-range, you need 24 or 26. And control is about the same. There is no specific rule for that. I think it's just important that you understand if you are building aggro, you probably are going to want less lands than if you are building mid-range and control. A combo deck is evaluating your combo and understanding how many lands you need for it to successfully occur, and then building from there. So the next thing that we can go over is how many copies of a given card you want to include in a deck. And that's where we can kind of go back to the geometric distribution. So we know that in a constructed format, we can have 4 copies of a given card, of a given spell in our deck. But the question is, how many copies of any given card do we want in our deck? How do we decide if we want just one? How do we decide if we want more? And hypergeometric distributions can be really helpful, because if we know we want to draw a certain, or if we know we want to draw a card in most of our games, do we want 3 or do we want 4? And hypergeometric distributions can give us exact kind of percentages that we can use to evaluate, okay, if I'm seeing this card this percent of time in matches, that is acceptable. Or obviously in some cases you want to see a card in every single game. That probably means you want 4 copies. You don't necessarily need to see the math in the hypergeometric distribution necessarily. But if you have other cards where you're unsure of how many copies you need, you can always refer to that to get some quick math to help you kind of figure out maybe how many copies might be necessary. And typically, with cards that we want lesser than 4 copies of, that's where it can kind of get more complicated. Cards you want to see every game, it's easy to just max out the 4 copies. It's where you're deciding between 1 and 3 copies. It can get more complicated. But using a hypergeometric distribution, I hopefully will have put up a chart for you guys by now that you can refer to. Screen grab it if you need it. It's just like a quick shortcut to help you kind of get the percentages down to see kind of the odds of drawing specific cards in a certain amount of time within a certain amount of draws based on the number of copies in your deck. And it should help with not only deciding how many lands you might want, but then also how many copies of a given spell you might want. And then the last thing that I want to discuss with you when it comes to constructed formats is sideboarding. Sideboarding is difficult. So in a constructed format, or at least in in a competitive environment, in a sanctioned event, or even I guess non-sanctioned events, whatever, you get 15 slots in your sideboard. So your 60 card deck is technically really 75 cards. You have 15 in your sideboard for games 2 and 3. So in a tournament, you're playing best of 3. So you're playing up to potentially 3 games. If you both win, if you and your opponent both win games 1 and 2, you would go to a third deciding game to decide obviously who is the winner. So in games 2 and games 3, you can refer to your sideboard to help you include 15 cards from your sideboard that you can put into your 60. You change in and out. You can remove cards that aren't good in the matchup and then put cards from the 15 that are good in the matchup into your 60. I mean, technically you could just put all 15 cards into your sideboard, but if there aren't land cards included in here, you'll dilute your draws and you'll probably get mana screwed. But essentially, you can remove cards from your deck that are bad in your matchup for games 2 and 3, and then include cards from your sideboard that help you in the matchup. So you can improve your chances of winning games 2 and 3. In sideboarding, these 15 cards are incredibly important and very, very difficult to fill. So a lot of times I'll see players do things like include a copy of Duress from their side, or just they'll just include a copy of Duress in their sideboard. And that's probably one of the biggest mistakes that I see, is players who just don't really pay attention to their sideboard and kind of lazily just include cards that are, this card is just good in, XY matchup. This card is just good. A lot of the times you'll see something like a Duress, or, some other sort of thing, some other sort of like blanket card, I'm trying to like Soul Guide Lantern. I'm trying to think of like specific graveyard hate. Relic of Progenitus. You know, you'll see players just kind of tack those on as 2 copies into their sideboard without really a thought. You know, it's good for graveyard disruption. For Relic of Progenitus, and Duress is good against control. And I think people really, by being lazy, cost themselves a lot of games when it comes to sideboarding. So what I really would urge people to do when they're sideboarding is to really evaluate the metagame that they're in from multiple perspectives. The first thing that I would do is look at the most popular deck and definitely commit at least a few sideboard slots, so a few slots of your 15 dedicated to cards that are good against the most popular deck, that obviously, like contextually speaking, also work with your deck if there's, you know, some sort of synergy with your deck, or, you know, even if it plays in the same color. If the most popular deck is a control deck, a few copies of Duress might not be the worst thing in the world. But I think people who, it just seems like a lot of the times when you look at people's sideboards, they just include something like a Duress or a Relic of Progenitus without an actual evaluation of what decks are being played at the time. So don't be that guy. Don't be the 2 copies of Duress for no reason guy. Be the 2 copies of Duress because this is the most popular deck in the format guy, or be the I don't have Duress in my format because there is no real matchup where I really technically want it, and you know, I'm not preparing for matchups that I'm probably not going to get. You know, good for the player who sits down and has 2 copies of Duress and or Relic of Progenitus and plays the fringe player who's playing a control deck or some sort of graveyard synergy deck. Good for you. You prepared for something that probably wasn't going to happen. You know, you won the die roll there, but be the player who thought proactively about what their sideboard should include based off the decks they were going to see. So again, let's look at the most popular deck in the format, and really commit maybe a few slots at least to cards that will help you against the most popular deck in the format. I mean, if you're just making a 60-card deck for fun to play with your friends, obviously you don't need to do this. This advice is more specifically for players who are newer and might be interested in competitive play. If you're just playing with your friends, your sideboard, if you even want to make one, obviously just know and understand what the decks that your friends are playing and what cards will help you against them. But in most cases, I think if you're playing casually, you probably aren't even, you know, making a sideboard, so you could probably disregard this. But yeah, evaluate the most popular deck in the format and commit at least a few slots of your sideboard to cards that will help you in that matchup. The next thing is I would evaluate what decks that are popular in the format, maybe not the most popular, but, you know, other of the most popular decks, you know, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th most popular decks in the format. Which of those decks does your deck beat with and without its sideboard? So which decks do you probably not need to commit a sideboard slot to because your deck beats it without the sideboard? And then which decks can your deck not beat unless it has a sideboard, and then committing more slots to those decks because you need the sideboard because you're at a disadvantage without it. And then from the other perspective, which decks beat your deck with a sideboard and which decks beat your deck without a sideboard? So I guess what I'm trying to say is you want to look at your deck, or you want to look at games from your deck's perspective and from your opponent's deck's perspective. Which decks beat your deck with and without a sideboard, and which decks do you beat with and without a sideboard? That'll help you make decisions on which cards to include within your 15-slot sideboard. spell within a deck. Although there are cases where they're, like, what is it? The Ring Wraiths and Persistent Partitioners. There are cards that allow for multiple copies. But unless it is said otherwise, you can have one copy of any given spell in a commander deck. So it's made up of 99 cards and one commander, which makes up the 100 cards. This format is going to be difficult for me to really kind of give you a lot of specific advice on, and like mana base and stuff like I did for the constructed format. So I'm just going to do my best to kind of give some basic advice for deck building within Commander. The first thing I'll say is that if you go on YouTube, I would say that using resources like YouTube, like EDH Rec, like MTG Goldfish is great. But the one thing I would not do if you're on YouTube, or if you're like looking up articles, if you ever see somebody say that your deck, or in general, commander decks need X lands, X removal, X amount of board wipes, X amount of ramp, I wouldn't really take any heed to that type of advice. You should never, especially with, I think, templating. So templating is looking at other people's decks and then using it as a template to build your own deck. And I think templating, and being told your deck needs a certain amount of each type of card type, or needs this amount of ramp, needs this amount of removal, this amount of board wipes. You can't apply that sort of mentality to your commander deck. It just doesn't work. So don't ever listen to that. In some cases, that type of thinking might be correct, but most of the times, you'll figure out what your deck needs by playing it over and over and over again. And that is probably my biggest piece of advice, is playing your deck. When you're doing your deck building, obviously it's 100 cards, that's a significant amount of cards, but if you utilize resources like EDH Rec and MTG Goldfish, and you have a commander that you like, and you have a pool of, if you use those resources, you'll probably have pools of hundreds of cards that you want to include, and you'll have to whittle it down to 100. My advice would be, get your deck into a playable state, into a 100 card, but don't discount, keep all of every card that you considered for the deck. Always keep it on hand. And as you play your games, the biggest thing you want to determine is what cards feel good every time you cast them, and what cards feel bad every time you cast them. And that'll help you figure out which cards to keep, and then which cards to cut. And when you have cards that you cut, replace them with cards from the pool of other cards you were considering, and evaluate them. Obviously, you're going to want to evaluate cards before you include them, but that's how you whittle it down to hundreds of cards instead of thousands. And then once you're at the hundreds, whittling it down to the 100 cards that you're going to include. But yeah, I would say that, like, to make that determination, you have to play, and you have to play it over and over and over again, because it's a multiplayer format, and because it's so unique in that you're playing with 100, unique cards. When certain cards come up, it might be a great card in the deck, but feel bad in a certain situation, because, 3 of your opponents are doing something that is causing, a certain very niche situation to occur. So you need to play, and play a lot, in order to really make determinations on which cards are good for the deck, and which cards can either be improved or are bad for the deck. And then is concerned. Not all players that play EDH are concerned with winning. But in my experience, I tried to build fun and fair decks in Commander, because I wanted to focus on having fun as opposed to winning. And to be honest, when you focus on having fun and not winning, by not, intentionally not including powerful combos and powerful cards, I found at least it ended up feeling really, really bad. Because you were watching your opponents do all these cool, powerful things, and you were just sitting there playing fair and purposefully ignoring good combos and good cards because you wanted to focus on having fun, and not instantly winning, making your opponents feel bad. If you have that mentality, don't. Part of the fun is winning, and you shouldn't take that away from yourself because you want to account for other people having a good time. People can have a good time. I mean, I was having fun watching my opponents do other things. It just felt bad when it got to my turn and I was doing, not great things because I was choosing not to. So don't be too nice of a guy. When you build your deck, put in a couple, and I'm not saying, I think there's, I guess what I'm trying to say is have a healthy balance of have fun and play to win. Because if you totally disregard playing to win, you're not actually going to have fun. You're going to watch your opponents have fun, and you're just going to let them kind of do their thing, and you're just going to kind of noodle and do nothing. So I would include a fair amount of copies of card combos or powerful cards that might, really feel bad for your opponents. Because something that you have to understand is part of the fun is, especially, or at least from my perspective, part of the fun is when my opponent resolves something that is really powerful and scary. It's, either working on that issue myself or with my opponents, to steer the game then in another direction, to overcome that difficulty. So yeah, don't sell yourself, or don't prevent yourself from having fun by trying to account for other people having fun. Include play to win cards, not pay to win cards. Well, in some cases they're probably pay to win, but if you understand what I'm trying to say, include cards that you might think are, your what's his name? Like your Narset Days Undoing combo, your Jin Gataxias cards, like your stacks pieces. If you're playing full stacks, like a full stacks deck, then, go fuck yourself. But if like you have like a stacks piece that would make it difficult for your opponents to play, one or two, your Thassa's Oracle and Enter the Infinite combos and stuff like that, like, don't not play with them because you want other people to have fun. Play with them because you want to have fun. Play for yourself first. Don't be the nice guy who's trying to account for other people. If you do that too much, it'll just lead to you feeling bad. And you shouldn't torture yourself like that. You're there to have fun. So it's okay to be a little selfish in that regard. So have fun. Do strong and powerful things. And if you're worried about your opponents, they should be, if they're your friends, they're probably good people because you're a good person. So they're probably, they're probably smart enough to know that, it's just a game. They're not going to be mad at you. If you're worried about strangers, if you're sitting down with strangers and they can't handle you resolving powerful spells and they complain about your deck building style and all that, they can go fuck themselves. And you don't have to play with them ever again. That's the beauty of sitting down at a table with strangers and deciding to play Magic is, when you go to your local game store and you find the people who are sore losers and assholes, is once the game is over, you can decline another game and find another pod, or buy a pack and go home. You know, if that's the only people there that are there, or you can sit by yourself and go on your phone and wait for more people to arrive and start another pod. So don't worry about your opponents. Don't worry about strangers. Don't worry about things you can't control. What you can control is having a good time playing Magic the Gathering with a deck that you like, with a commander that you like. So play the good cards. Don't worry about other people. That actually might be my most important piece of advice, because that's something I struggled with for a long time, much longer than I needed to. I was building fun and fair decks in a format where fun and fair really isn't going to get you anywhere, and where fun and fair really isn't fun. Fair isn't fun. You need to be playing a little unfair, and that's okay. But yeah. And then I don't really know that I have much else advice when it comes to EDH. Yeah, I think that is about all I have for EDH. Is have fun, but definitely try in some cases to include cards that are powerful and that'll let you win. And if your opponents feel bad about it, fuck them. So yeah, that's about all I have for EDH deck building. So yeah, that's kind of a basic deck building 101 video for you when it comes to 60 card constructed formats and 100 card EDH, or 100 card the commander format. Hopefully this has taught you something, and hopefully hypergeometric distributions weren't too much of a headache. It really is a tool, like statistics and the mathematics behind deciding how many copies of a card, how many copies of lands, not necessarily how many copies of a specific land, but how many lands necessarily you want in your deck in its entirety. You might honestly scoff and say that, like, there's no way you actually use hypergeometric distributions, but I do. In a lot of cases, if I'm building, in a lot of cases, when I have built my own decks, I've used them, but typically when it comes to, I guess this is a bit more advice, when it comes to, like, metagaming, you probably don't necessarily need the mathematics behind it. Somebody else has probably already done it. So if you're just templating, if you're looking at the most popular decks and you look at, like, if you look at a format, I guess this could be my last piece of advice for everybody. And that's, what's called, and you might hear this a lot, but metagaming. So let's say you're not like me and you don't want to do the math, you don't necessarily want to deck build for yourself, you don't want to create your own deck, or create a version of an existing deck in a different way or whatever. You don't want to do that. That's just not your style. You just want to play Magic. You don't care necessarily about the deck building process. You just want a deck and to play it. So what's metagaming or net decking is essentially, you just go on the internet. The internet is the best resource for Magic the Gathering now. You can just go on the internet, go to MTG Top 8. You can go to MTG Decks, MTG Goldfish. There's a lot of different websites that have all of the best decks in a given format. So Pioneer, Modern, Commander, it'll have a lot of the decks being played in that format. You can just take a look at those decks, see what speaks to you, pick one of those decks, and then play it. And if you think that the either of those decks made a mistake when it came to lands. Maybe they feuded, you've played the deck and a lot of the times you've found that you haven't found enough lands as you're playing, or you have drawn too many lands. You can, or this card was not as good as you expected, or this card is better than you expected. You can kind of tune what other people have done from there, and then from there you're kind of deck building, right? So you can see what other people have done and then improve upon that, or style it to your own tastes. So in a way, you are deck building by metagaming or net decking in that way. So yeah, I think that would be my last piece of advice: is if all of this, if the mathematics aren't for you, if the creativity or the creative side, I don't want to say you're not a creative person, but if that's not what you're interested in, then something like this is perfectly fine. That's a great way. I do it all the time. I don't have the energy to build a deck from scratch all the time and try to make these kinds of decisions and figure out certain parts of the math, which again isn't as complicated, but also it is something that you have to sit down and do. So not everybody wants to do that. So yeah, net deck and metagame. Well, I guess metagaming and net decking. Metagaming would be like looking at what people are playing. Net decking is actually then taking the deck, and so these things kind of go hand in hand. But metagaming is looking at what people are doing, looking at all the different kind of decks that are being played. What are the most popular decks? Net decking would then be picking one of those decks and making a template for a deck that you're gonna either like just taking the list and playing it. And yeah, I think you get what I'm trying to say. But the internet is a great resource. I'm sure that in 2024, I don't need to tell you that, but yeah, for those of you who you found this video because you're on the internet, so you know that it exists. You can use it for Magic. If you didn't know that, congratulations, now you do, and now you can go net deck to your heart's content. But yeah, that's it. So hopefully for newer players, this has gotten you an understanding of how to create a deck, and given you a little bit of an understanding of the mathematics necessary to figure out how to build a successful mana base and how many copies of a given card you might want to include in your deck. Giving you an understanding of the archetypes that exist within Magic and kind of the restrictions or rules or kind of general guidelines of building those decks. For the Commander players out there, hopefully, for any newer players that are interested in Commander, hopefully I taught you something and gave you a little bit of advice, but it's really kind of tough to do that.